They say a man's legacy is measured in the lives he touches. I learned this truth not in the halls of power, not on battlefields, but in the dirt, in the endless rows of wheat that stretched across Mexican fields like golden rivers. I am Norman Borlaug, and though my body has returned to the earth I once labored upon, my voice still echoes in the rustle of grain that feeds 1 billion souls. They called me many things: a fool, a dreamer, a man who wouldn't accept reality. Scientists in white coats told me it was impossible. Economists said it would never work. Politicians laughed at the notion that a farm boy from Iowa could solve world hunger. Perhaps they were right to doubt. But in 1944, I stepped off a train in Mexico City with $47 in my pocket, a borrowed microscope, and a promise I intended to keep. A promise that would change everything. From this place beyond time, I see it all clearly now. Every failed experiment, every seed that refused to grow. Every night I fell asleep in dirt-floored shacks, wondering if I was wasting my life chasing an impossible dream. But I also see the faces, the mothers who no longer watched their children starve, the farmers who finally harvested enough to feed their families, the villages that transformed from despair to hope. This is not a story about science, though science was my weapon. This is a story about stubbornness, about refusing to accept that millions must die simply because that's how it's always been, about standing in a field of dying wheat and saying, no, not on my watch. Let me take you back to where it began, not in Mexico, but in a small barn in Cresco, Iowa, where a young boy first learned that hunger is the cruelest master of all. I was 10 years old when I first understood what poverty meant. Not the kind you read about in books, but the kind that sits at your dinner table like an unwelcome guest. My father worked the land from sunrise to sunset, his hands cracked and bleeding, his back bent like the corn stalks after a storm. Some years we had enough, most years we didn't. I remember standing in our field after the wheat rust came, the entire crop blackened and dying, hundreds of acres destroyed by a fungus we couldn't see and didn't understand. My father stood there, silent, his shoulders shaking. Not crying, he never cried, but shaking with the weight of failure. That night we ate boiled potatoes, again, for the 7th night in a row. The neighbor's boy Tommy died that winter. Not from anything dramatic, just malnutrition. His body simply gave up. He was 8 years old. I decided something that day, standing by his small grave in the frozen ground. If I ever got the chance, I would make sure no child died because wheat wouldn't grow. It seemed like a simple promise. It would take me 40 years to keep it. The city swallowed me whole. Dust and diesel fumes, vendors shouting in Spanish I barely understood, children running barefoot through streets that smelled of rotting fruit and hope. I had a doctorate in plant pathology from the University of Minnesota. I had studied fungal diseases in laboratories with equipment that cost more than most Mexicans earned in a lifetime. I had absolutely no idea what I was walking into. The Rockefeller Foundation had sent me here with a mission: help Mexico feed itself. The country was importing half its wheat. Famine stalked the countryside like a predator. The government was desperate. But desperation doesn't grow wheat. Science does. Or so I thought. They took me to the experimental station at Chapingo. 40 acres of rocky soil, a few rusted tools, and a shack that leaked when it rained. My laboratory was a wooden table under a tree. My team were 3 Mexican farmers who looked at me like I was crazy, which I probably was. The first day, I stood in the field and realized everything I'd learned in America was useless here. The climate was wrong. The soil was wrong. The wheat varieties that thrived in Iowa turned to dust under the Mexican sun. The fungal diseases I'd studied? Different strains here, more aggressive, deadlier.
I wrote to my wife that night, "I think I've made a terrible mistake." But I didn't leave, couldn't leave, because every day I saw the faces of farmers who needed this to work, men like my father, men who broke their backs for soil that refused to give. And I thought of Tommy, cold in his Iowa grave. Every experiment died. The wheat couldn't handle the heat. The rust attacked faster than I could breed resistance. The Mexican farmers began to avoid eye contact when they saw me. They'd seen scientists before, men with degrees and promises who disappeared when reality proved harder than theory.
But I learned something that year, something they don't teach in universities. The textbook said you could only breed wheat once a year, plant in spring, harvest in fall, analyze the results, try again next year. 1 generation per season, progress measured in decades. I stood in that field in November, staring at the failed crop and thought, what if they're wrong? Mexico has 2 growing seasons, the highlands in summer, the lowlands in winter, different climates, different altitudes. If I could shuttle the seeds between them, I could breed 2 generations per year, cut the timeline in half. It violated every principle of conventional agriculture. The experts said it couldn't work. The plants would be too stressed. The genetic selection would be unstable. I didn't care what the experts said anymore. I'd listened to experts my whole life, and 1 billion people were still hungry. The Yaqui Valley stretched before me like a vision, harsh, unforgiving, beautiful in its brutality. This would be my winter station. I would plant here while others rested, harvest while they planned. I would work twice as fast because I didn't have time for patience. The local farmers thought I was insane. The wheat will die in this heat, they said. You're wasting your time. They were right about the dying part. That first winter crop failed spectacularly, but I learned from every dead plant. I bred the survivors. I crossbred the strongest with the most resistant. I worked 18-hour days in heat that made my hands blister and my vision blur. Maria, one of the local women who cooked for the workers, brought me water one afternoon. I was on my knees in the dirt, examining wheat kernels with a magnifying glass, my shirt soaked with sweat, my face burned red by the sun. "Senor Borlaug," she said quietly, "why do you do this? You could go home. You could have an easy life." I looked up at her. My neighbor's boy died because we couldn't grow enough food. His name was Tommy. He was 8 years old. She nodded slowly, set down the water, and walked away. The next day, she brought her son to help me. His name was Carlos. Not with fanfare, not with celebration, just a single row of wheat in the Sonora desert that didn't die. The stalks stood strong despite the heat. The kernels resisted the rust. The yield was triple what traditional Mexican farmers normally harvested. I stood there, hands shaking, afraid to believe it was real. I'd bred over 6,000 different varieties in 3 years, 6,000 failures for this one fragile success. But it was real. The numbers didn't lie. Then came the next problem. The wheat grew too well. The stalks were so heavy with grain that they toppled over before harvest. All that work, all that promise, lying in the dirt, rotten. The experts said, "You've hit the biological limit. Wheat can only produce so much." I said, "Then we'll change the wheat." I traveled to occupied Japan to study their short-stalked wheat varieties. Dwarf wheat, they called it, bred over centuries to withstand typhoons. The stalks were thick, strong, half the height of normal wheat. They looked ridiculous, stubby, weak, but they didn't fall over. I brought the seeds back to Mexico like a man carrying treasure. The scientists mocked me. "Dwarf wheat? It'll never produce enough. The stalks are too short." I crossbred the Japanese dwarf with my high-yielding Mexican varieties. It took 4 years and 3,000 more experiments. 4 years of colleagues telling me I was wasting time. 4 years of watching the funding slowly disappear.
4 years of letters from my wife asking when I was coming home. But in 1956, in a field outside Sonora, I harvested wheat that changed everything. Short stalks, heavy with grain, rust-resistant, heat-tolerant, yielding 6 times more than traditional Mexican varieties. I held the kernels in my palm and cried for the first time since Tommy's funeral. Mexico became self-sufficient in wheat. After importing half their grain for decades, now they grew more than they could eat. The transformation happened so fast, it seemed like magic. Villages that had known hunger for generations suddenly had surplus. Children grew taller, malnutrition rates plummeted. The government held a ceremony, medals, speeches. They called me a hero. But that same week, I received a letter from the Rockefeller Foundation. Budget cuts. They were scaling back the program. The mission was accomplished, they said. Mexico was fed. Time to move on. I stood in my office reading that letter and felt rage like I'd never known. Mexico was fed. But what about India, Pakistan? The entire subcontinent teetered on the edge of mass starvation. Hundreds of millions of people. And we were going to walk away because we'd solved one country's problem? I wrote back a single sentence. The work has barely begun. They didn't respond. I stepped off the plane in Delhi into heat that felt like judgment. The poverty was beyond anything I'd seen in Mexico. Children with swollen bellies, mothers with empty eyes, cities overflowing with refugees fleeing famine in the countryside. The Indian government was skeptical. They'd seen Western solutions before. Green Revolution, they'd heard us call it. It sounded like another colonial scheme. Take our land, take our traditions, replace them with American methods. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, an Indian agricultural scientist, met me at the station. He was the only one who believed. "Can you really feed India?" he asked. I looked out the car window at the endless sprawl of humanity. "I don't know, but I'm gonna die trying." The first challenge was political. Getting the Indian government to import my Mexican wheat seeds required navigating bureaucracy that made Mexican corruption look simpler. Every permit, every approval, every step forward required convincing another skeptical official that an Iowa farm boy knew better than centuries of Indian agricultural tradition. It took 18 months to get approval to import 18 tons of seeds.
When they finally arrived at the port of Mumbai, the customs officials refused to release them. The paperwork was wrong, they said. Some minor detail on Form 47B, subsection C. The seeds sat in a hot warehouse, dying slowly, while bureaucrats argued about stamps and signatures. I bribed everyone I could find, spent money I didn't have, called in favors from people I'd never met. Swaminathan worked his government connections. We fought for every single seed like it was a human life. Because it was. We finally got the seeds released, distributed them to farmers across Punjab and Haryana, demonstrated the new techniques, taught them about fertilizer, irrigation, the precise methods needed to maximize yield. Then came the war with Pakistan. The border exploded in conflict. Punjab became a battlefield. Farmers abandoned their fields to flee or fight. My experimental crops sat in contested territory, shells falling around them like deadly rain. I received a telegram from the Rockefeller Foundation. "Return to Mexico immediately. Your safety cannot be guaranteed." I tore it up. Instead, I drove to the fields with Swaminathan. We worked under artillery fire, harvesting what we could, protecting the seeds. A Pakistani shell landed 50 yards from where I stood. The explosion knocked me down, filled my mouth with dirt, left my ears ringing for a week. Swaminathan pulled me to my feet. "You're insane!" he shouted over the gunfire. "Probably," I shouted back, "but if we lose these seeds, millions die." We saved enough for the next planting, barely. When the war ended and the dust settled, the wheat we'd planted began to grow.
Not in experimental plots, not in controlled conditions, but across millions of acres of Indian farmland. The yields were impossible. Farmers who'd harvested 800 pounds per acre for generations suddenly pulled 5,000 pounds from the same soil. Villages that had known hunger for centuries suddenly had surplus. Food markets that had been empty filled with grain. The news spread like fire. More farmers demanded the seeds. We couldn't grow them fast enough. The Indian government, finally believing, threw their full support behind the program. They built seed multiplication facilities, trained thousands of agricultural workers, turned the Green Revolution from experiment into national policy. By 1968, India's wheat production had doubled. By 1974, it had tripled. The country that had been the world's largest wheat importer became self-sufficient. I stood in a Punjab field, watching farmers harvest more grain than their grandfathers had thought possible, and I thought of Tommy, of my father's shaking shoulders in that Iowa field, of every child who would now live because wheat had learned to grow where it once died. They awarded me the Nobel Peace Prize, not for chemistry, not for agriculture, for peace, because, they said, feeding the hungry does more for world stability than any treaty. I stood on that stage in my rented tuxedo, feeling like a fraud. The King of Sweden shook my hand. The audience applauded. Cameras flashed. Everyone called me a hero. But I knew the truth. The Green Revolution was saving lives, yes, but it was also creating new problems. The heavy fertilizer use was contaminating water supplies. The focus on high-yield wheat was replacing traditional crop diversity. Small farmers who couldn't afford the inputs were being left behind. Critics called me an agent of Western imperialism, said I was destroying traditional agriculture, enslaving poor farmers to chemical companies, creating environmental catastrophe. Some of them were right. In my hotel room that night, I sat with the Nobel medal in my hands, its weight nothing compared to the weight of moral complexity. I set out to save lives. I succeeded. But every solution creates new problems. Every answer raises new questions. I thought about writing a speech addressing the critics, defending my work, explaining that perfection is the enemy of good, that 1 billion people were alive who would have died, that nothing, absolutely nothing, justifies letting children starve while we debate the purity of our methods. But I didn't write it. Instead, I went back to work. By the 1980s, the world had moved on. Hunger hadn't been eliminated, but it had been pushed back. The acute famines that had threatened to kill millions now killed thousands. Still tragic, but not apocalyptic. The media stopped calling. The awards stopped coming. I became a relic, a reminder of a crisis people wanted to forget. Young environmentalists saw me as the villain of their stories, the man who'd introduced harmful agricultural practices, the scientist who'd chosen short-term yields over long-term sustainability. They weren't entirely right, but they weren't entirely wrong either. I spent my final decades trying to bring the Green Revolution to Africa. The continent still suffered massive hunger. The techniques that worked in Mexico and India could work there, too, I was certain. But Africa was harder, more politically unstable, more climatically diverse, less infrastructure. The funding never materialized. The political will evaporated. I watched millions die of preventable starvation while the world looked away, focused on new crises, new causes, new problems. It broke something inside me. I died in my sleep at 95, my body finally giving up the fight my mind refused to surrender. The obituaries were kind. They called me the man who saved 1 billion lives. They praised my persistence. They noted my Nobel Prize. What they didn't mention was the weight, the impossible burden of being responsible for so many lives. The nights I couldn't sleep, haunted by the people I hadn't saved. The villages in Africa still starving. The environmental damage my methods had caused. The complexity that simple solutions always hide. From this place beyond the veil, I see it all now. The wheat still grows in fields across the world, descended from those varieties I bred in Mexican dirt. The billion lives saved have had children, who've had children, who've had children. The ripples of those decisions spreading across time like waves on an infinite ocean. But I also see the problems, the soil degradation, the water depletion, the loss of crop diversity, the new challenges my solutions created. Every answer generating new questions, every triumph containing the seeds of future struggles. Sometimes, in the quiet moments beyond death, I imagine myself walking once more through those Mexican fields, the Yaqui Valley heat pressing down like a benediction, the wheat rustling in the wind, speaking in voices only farmers understand. I see the faces of those who helped, Maria, who brought water to a sunburned fool, Carlos, her son, who spent his childhood in fields of dreams, Swaminathan, who bet his career on an American scientist's crazy ideas, the Mexican farmers who kept faith when every expert said to give up. And I see Tommy, 8 years old, forever frozen in my memory, the child who died because wheat wouldn't grow, the promise that drove me across continents and decades, the ghost that haunted every experiment, every failure, every impossible choice. Did I keep that promise? 1 billion people lived who would have died, but millions still die of hunger every year. The Green Revolution saved lives, but created dependencies, solved problems, but generated new ones. Every triumph incomplete, every victory partial.
The wheat still grows, in fields I'll never see, in countries are never visited, feeding children I'll never meet. My genes may have returned to dust, but my wheat's genes ripple across the planet, adapting, evolving, continuing the work I started in that Mexican field with $47 and a stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable. They ask me from beyond the grave what I learned, what wisdom I can offer, what truth justifies a lifetime in the dirt, fighting battles against microscopic enemies, breeding plants while the world burned and starved and struggled. Here's what I know. The experts will always tell you it's impossible. They'll have excellent reasons, sound science, practical limitations, historical precedent. Listen to them, learn from them, then ignore them and try anyway. The work will break you. Every success will reveal 10 new failures. Every life saved will remind you of 10 more lost. The weight of responsibility will crush you if you let it. Do the work anyway. You won't save everyone. The world is too complex, the problems too deep, the resources too limited. You'll lie awake at night thinking about the ones you missed, the villages you couldn't reach, the children who died while you were solving different problems. Make peace with your limits, then push them anyway. Your solutions will create new problems. Nothing is pure, nothing is perfect. Every answer generates new questions. Accept the complexity, then act anyway. And most importantly, do not let perfection stop you from doing good. The critics who demand flawless solutions while children starve are accomplices to murder. The philosophers who debate methods while people die are luxury the hungry cannot afford. Feed the hungry, solve the immediate crisis, then deal with the consequences, because consequences can be addressed, but death is permanent. Now, from this place beyond time, I watch the fields. The wheat rises in Punjab and falls in Iowa. It grows in Australia and withers in drought-stricken Africa. The cycle continues, eternal, indifferent to the man who once tried to bend it to his will. But sometimes, when the wind moves through the grain just right, I swear I can hear voices. The farmers singing as they harvest, the children playing in fields that once grew nothing but dust, the mothers feeding sons and daughters who, in another timeline, would have been buried young. And in those moments, I think, maybe it was enough.
Maybe the lives saved outweighed the problems created. Maybe the work, imperfect and incomplete, still mattered. I am Norman Borlaug. I saved 1 billion lives and created 1,000 new problems. I fed the hungry and damaged the earth. I kept my promise to a dead boy and broke 1,000 others I never intended to make. The wheat still grows, the work continues, and somewhere, in a field I'll never see, a child eats bread and lives another day. That's enough. It has to be enough.